Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. It was a calm evening, the kind that lulled you into a sense of contentment without much effort. I had settled into my usual routine: soft lighting, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the faint glow of the television playing something I wasn't even paying attention to. The rhythmic predictability of my life always brought me a strange sense of comfort, even if it bordered on monotony. I had spent most of the day running errands and was glad to finally have a moment to myself. My small house had always been my sanctuary, a place where I felt safe, untouchable by the chaos of the outside world. Tonight was no different, or at least that's what I thought. As I leaned back in my chair, my gaze wandered absent-mindedly to the shadows stretching across the floor. Something shifted in the corner of my eye, a faint movement, quick and almost imperceptible. My heart skipped for a moment, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably just the way the shadows danced as the TV screen flickered. Still, I found myself glancing back toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. The shadows there seemed darker, almost too still, but I laughed it off. Living alone had its moments of paranoia, and I knew better than to let my imagination get the better of me. I turned back to the screen, determined to shake off the unease. The moment passed and the house settled back into its quiet rhythm. I convinced myself that nothing was amiss and let the comforting lull of my routine take over again. But something felt different. It started faintly, so soft at first that I thought it was my mind filling the silence. A dull creak, followed by a barely audible shuffle. My stomach tightened as the sound repeated, more deliberate this time. Footsteps, light, careful, and unmistakable, traveled down the corridor toward the living room where I sat. My breath caught, and I froze, straining to listen. For a moment, I wondered if it was the house settling, the kind of noises that old homes make in the night. But no, this was different. These sounds had weight, purpose. I felt the prickling sensation of being watched. The air felt heavier, pressing down on my chest as I strained to hear what was coming next. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer, each one amplifying my dread. Someone was in the house. Before I could even think about confronting the source, my instincts took over. I bolted from the living room, adrenaline driving me straight to my bedroom at the end of the hall. My hands fumbled with the lock as I pushed the door shut behind me, slamming it with a force that sent a reverberation through the house. Once the lock clicked into place, I pressed my ear against the door, listening. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, I stood there, paralyzed. My breaths were shallow, loud in the suffocating quiet. I couldn't afford to lose focus. If someone was out there, I needed to do something. I grabbed the chair by my desk and wedged it under the doorknob. My arms shook as I pushed the heavy dresser against the door, every scrape of wood on wood feeling deafeningly loud. I crouched down near the corner of the room, clutching the first heavy object I could find, a small lamp, its ceramic base cold against my palm. My gaze darted between the door and the shadows in the room, half expecting them to move. Then I heard it. The doorknob rattled, not frantically but deliberately, as though someone was testing the lock. Each click of the metal against the frame sent a chill racing through me. The rattling stopped, replaced by something far worse. A whisper, low, guttural, and just loud enough to be heard through the door. I couldn't make out the words, if there were any at all, but the sound was unmistakable. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the world I knew. I clutched the lamp tighter, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to defend myself if that door opened. But it didn't. The whispers continued, growing quieter, as if the speaker was retreating. I stayed rooted to the spot, refusing to move. Time became meaningless as I sat there, waiting. Minutes felt like hours, and I lost track of how long I'd been crouched in the corner of my room. The whispers had faded completely, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt almost alive. Every sound in the house became amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the groan of the pipes, the faint buzz of electricity in the walls. My mind turned these harmless noises into threats, each one setting my nerves on edge. I wanted to call for help, but my phone was in the living room, far beyond reach. The thought of opening the door and walking down the hallway made my skin crawl. No, I couldn't risk it. I had to wait. The hours dragged on, and the adrenaline that had kept me alert began to wane. Exhaustion tugged at my eyelids, but fear kept me awake. My muscles ached from staying in the same position, my body screaming for relief, but I couldn't let my guard down. Not yet. Finally, the faintest hint of dawn began to seep through the curtains. The pale light cast long, gray shadows across the room, but it brought a small measure of relief. Whatever or whoever had been in the house was gone now. At least I hoped so. I stood slowly, my legs trembling from the hours of tension, and faced the door. It was time to see what awaited me on the other side. The silence outside my bedroom door felt heavier than the night had been. The faint gray light creeping through the curtains illuminated my barricade, making it look more pathetic than it had felt in the throes of panic. I hesitated with my hand on the chair wedged under the doorknob. My heart pounded as I mustered the courage to pull it away. The lock clicked as I turned it, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. With a deep breath, I cracked the door open, just enough to peek out. The hallway was empty, bathed in the muted light of early morning. I opened the door wider, stepping cautiously into the hallway. My bare feet brushed against the cool wood floor as I moved forward, my ears straining for the slightest sound. The living room lay ahead, undisturbed, its furnishings just as I'd left them. But something was off. The house felt too still, as though it was holding its breath. I glanced toward the front door and froze. It was open, a narrow gap revealing the pale light of dawn spilling onto the porch. My mind raced as I approached the door. I couldn't remember leaving it unlocked, let alone open. I reached out to touch it but stopped short, unsure of what I was even looking for. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches on the lock, no scuff marks on the floor. It was as though whoever had been inside had left without a trace. I peered outside, my hand gripping the doorframe. The street was quiet, the neighborhood still shrouded in the remnants of the night. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet the open door told a different story. Stepping back inside, I did a quick sweep of the house. Each room appeared untouched, the furniture exactly as I had left it. I lingered in the living room, staring at my phone sitting innocuously on the coffee table. The normalcy of it all felt wrong. Despite the evidence, or lack thereof, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched. That someone, or something, had been in my space, violating the sense of safety I had always taken for granted. I spent the morning combing through every corner of the house, searching for something, anything that might explain the events of the night. I checked the windows, the locks, even the vents, but found nothing out of place. The whispers replayed in my head, a phantom sound that made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had fallen asleep and dreamt the whole thing. But the barricade in my bedroom and the open front door said otherwise. I debated calling the police, but what would I tell them? There were no signs of a break-in, no proof that anything had actually happened. The thought of explaining the whispers and the rattling doorknob made me feel ridiculous. Instead, I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house replaced by the afternoon. I ordered security cameras online, determined to arm myself with some form of protection. I've been a delivery driver for over 3 years, and the job is nothing if not predictable. Every day is a blur of identical tasks. Pick up the order, navigate crowded streets, deliver to another doorstep, repeat. It's a routine so monotonous that it almost becomes soothing, until something disrupts it. That night was no different from any other, at least at first. I received a notification for a delivery to an apartment complex I'd never visited before. The address was tucked into the outskirts of the city, where the roads grew narrower and the streetlights fewer. The GPS guided me into a lot surrounded by rows of tall, shadowy buildings. It was the kind of place that felt simultaneously deserted and alive, with flickering lights in random windows and the occasional silhouette darting past. The order was straightforward, a single bag from a local takeout joint. Building 14, Unit 308. I climbed the stairs, bag in hand, my mind occupied with thoughts of finishing my shift early. The hallway was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of damp carpet and stale food. As I approached the door, I noticed it was slightly open, a crack wide enough to reveal darkness within. At first, I assumed the customer was waiting for me, but as I stepped closer, I realized no one was there. The silence pressed down, unnerving in its completeness. I cleared my throat, knocking lightly on the doorframe. "Delivery!" My voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the stillness. Nothing. I placed the bag carefully by the door, glancing inside out of habit. The faint glow of a television screen illuminated an empty couch and a coffee table, but no movement. It felt wrong, but I convinced myself it wasn't my business to pry. Maybe they'd stepped out for a moment. Maybe they'd fallen asleep. I walked back down the hallway with a growing sense of relief, eager to leave. As I descended the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't look back. The memory of that delivery stuck with me, replaying in fragments over the next few days. It wasn't uncommon to encounter strange situations on the job. People forgetting to answer their doors, odd smells wafting from behind closed spaces. But something about that open door gnawed at me. I started noticing changes in my routine. I double-checked the locks on my car at every stop. My eyes lingered on darkened windows, searching for shadows where none should be. Every creak of a door or shuffle of feet behind me felt sharper, like I was suddenly attuned to the smallest disturbances. By the end of the week, I'd almost managed to push the incident to the back of my mind. But when the app notified me of another delivery to the same address, my stomach sank. Building 14, Unit 308. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I'd built the whole thing up in my head. Besides, I needed the money. I accepted the order. Driving to the complex felt different this time. The route seemed darker, quieter, as though the city itself were holding its breath. By the time I parked and stepped out of the car, my chest felt tight and my legs moved with reluctance. The building loomed above me, its windows reflecting the weak glow of distant streetlights. I climbed the stairs with a growing sense of unease, my hands gripping the delivery bag tighter than necessary. When I reached the third floor, the hallway felt even darker than before, the faint hum of fluorescent lights doing little to cut through the shadows. And then I saw it, the door to Unit 308, ajar once more. My breath hitched as I approached, the same oppressive silence wrapping around me like a shroud. This time, though, it wasn't just the open door that stopped me. From the blackness within, a voice called out. Low and steady, it spoke a single word, "Come." I froze. The sound was unmistakable, a hollow invitation that echoed through the empty hallway. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air felt heavier, pressing down on me with invisible weight. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to decide whether to abandon the bag or step closer. Every rational part of me wanted to bolt, but something deeper, a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, kept me rooted to the spot. Before I could make a choice, I felt it, a sharp, deliberate shove against my back. The force sent me stumbling forward, through the threshold and into the apartment. I caught myself just before falling, my hands slamming against the cold, tiled floor. The sound echoed in the suffocating darkness, and I scrambled to my feet, my pulse thundering in my ears. The door swung shut behind me. I stood frozen, the silence around me now absolute. My breaths came in short, shallow bursts as I scanned the space, my eyes struggling to adjust. The faint outline of the furniture was the only thing visible, illuminated by the dim light spilling in from the hallway. No one was there. I turned and bolted for the door, yanking it open with a strength I didn't know I had. The hallway felt like a lifeline as I ran, my footsteps pounding against the carpeted floor. I didn't stop until I was in my car, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling hands. My chest heaved as I sat there, staring at the building in my rearview mirror. I didn't care if I got reported. I didn't care if the order was never delivered. All I knew was that I was never going back. Driving away from the apartment complex, I couldn't stop shaking. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Every glance in the rearview mirror felt like a mistake. I half expected to see someone or something following me. I kept the car moving, weaving through streets with no destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to be far, far away from Unit 308. Eventually, I pulled into a convenience store parking lot. The bright, artificial lights felt like a shield, pushing back the oppressive darkness I'd just escaped. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring blankly ahead, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The shove, the voice, the door shutting on its own. It all replayed in my mind in fragments, each memory more unreal than the last. Despite the fear, part of me wanted answers. Was someone playing a cruel joke? Had I stumbled into some kind of setup? But every time I considered going back, a wave of nausea hit me, stronger than anything I'd felt before. My body knew what my mind refused to accept. I couldn't go back. Not ever. That night I slept with the lights on, or rather I tried to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that dark apartment, feeling the shove, hearing that voice. When dawn finally broke, I was still awake, the weight of the night pressing down on me like a stone. Over the next few days, I tried to resume my routine. I took deliveries in busier areas, avoiding anything even remotely close to that part of town. I told myself it was just a bad night, an isolated incident, and that I could move past it if I focused on work. For a while, it seemed to work. But then the small things started happening. It began with my car. One morning, I found faint, hand-shaped smudges on the rear window. They weren't obvious, just greasy outlines that could easily be missed. But once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. I scrubbed the glass clean, but the feeling lingered. The next day, I found a single piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. It was blank, nothing but a sheet of dull white, but it sent a chill through me. I told myself it was probably a flyer that had been blown by the wind, but the idea didn't stick. It felt deliberate, like a message I wasn't meant to understand. Then, late one evening, I stepped out onto my porch and found something waiting for me. The same takeout bag I delivered to Unit 308. It was empty, its edges crumpled and stained, but there was no mistaking it. My knees nearly buckled at the sight, and I hurried back inside, locking the door and shutting every curtain. Something had followed me. After the bag appeared, the sense of unease I'd been trying to suppress grew into full-blown paranoia. I felt watched, constantly. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far, every sound too deliberate. Even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never truly alone. I started noticing other things, small things, but enough to unsettle me further. Objects in my apartment would be out of place. A chair slightly turned, a cupboard door left ajar. At first I thought I was imagining it, but the pattern became undeniable. Someone, or something, had been there. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the hallway outside my door, soft but insistent, like a knuckle rapping against wood. My heart raced as I stared at the door, the sound growing louder with each passing second. I didn't dare move. The tapping stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so profound it felt like a weight pressing on my chest. I stayed frozen, my body refusing to respond, until the first rays of dawn began to seep through the window. Only then did I muster the courage to check the hallway. It was empty. When the delivery app notified me of another order to Building 14, Unit 308, I knew I had reached my breaking point. I didn't even open the request. My finger hovered over the delete account button, and within seconds it was done. I couldn't risk it. Not again. Visiting my grandparents was a habit as much as it was a joy. Their home, nestled deep in the countryside, was my escape from the noise and chaos of everyday life. Each visit felt like stepping into a different world, one where time slowed down and the demands of the modern world seemed distant and irrelevant. Their house stood at the edge of a sprawling forest, its tall windows framing views of ancient trees that stretched far into the horizon. Evening meals were long and leisurely, filled with the comforting rhythm of conversation. The crackle of the fireplace often punctuated our silences, and the scent of my grandmother's cooking lingered well into the night. It was a place where I felt safe, removed from anything remotely unsettling. That evening, however, I stayed later than usual. The sun had long dipped below the horizon by the time I decided to head home. My grandparents insisted I stay the night, worried about me walking back through the forest road in the dark. But I reassured them, as I always did. "I've done it dozens of times," I told them with a laugh. "It's nothing to worry about. I waved them goodbye and stepped into the cool night air, flashlight in hand. The path ahead was well trodden, cutting through the dense forest that separated their home from mine. The air was still, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I adjusted the flashlight's beam and began my walk, feeling the quiet calm of the night settle over me. The forest was both a comfort and a source of unease. During the day, it was alive with birdsong and the warm glow of sunlight filtering through the canopy. But at night, it transformed. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the familiar path seemed narrower, more enclosed. The beam of my flashlight cut through the pitch blackness, its narrow circle of light my only guide. I walked briskly, my footsteps crunching against the gravel path. The solitude, once a comfort, now felt heavy. The forest seemed too quiet, its silence unnatural, broken only by the faint rustling of unseen creatures. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the night, nothing more. As I reached the midpoint of the road, the trees seemed denser, their shadows deeper. The chill in the air felt sharper, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight. Something about the night felt off, though I couldn't place why. It was a feeling in the back of my mind, a nagging sense that I wasn't entirely alone. And then I heard it, a faint hum, distant and unplaceable. I stopped in my tracks, scanning the darkness for its source. The sound didn't grow louder, nor did it fade away. It simply lingered, low and steady, like the drone of something far away but enormous. The hum was joined by a sudden, blinding light that erupted from above, flooding the forest in an unnatural brilliance. It wasn't the pale yellow of a street lamp or the bluish glow of a car's headlights. This light was harsh and pure, cutting through the darkness like a knife. I instinctively shielded my eyes, my flashlight dropping to the ground. The beam from above was fixed on me, unwavering. It illuminated everything, the trees, the path, even the smallest details of the underbrush, casting long, sharp shadows in every direction. My heart pounded as I tilted my head upward. Hovering silently above the treetops was an object I couldn't comprehend. Its surface was smooth and seamless, reflecting the blinding light it emitted. It didn't make a sound, defying every instinct that told me something so massive should be roaring like an engine. Instead, it hovered there, impossibly still, its beam trained on me. My legs refused to move, locked in place by a mixture of shock and fear. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood there, helpless under the unyielding gaze of the light. I didn't know how long I remained frozen, seconds, minutes, hours. It all blurred together. Finally, survival instinct kicked in. My body moved before my mind could catch up, and I bolted off the road, diving into the thick underbrush. The branches clawed at me as I scrambled for cover, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I pressed myself against the cold earth, heart hammering, as the light scanned the area. From my hiding spot, I could see the beam moving methodically, sweeping over the road and the surrounding forest. It wasn't erratic or random. It was deliberate, as if searching for something or someone. I pressed myself lower against the ground, trying to make myself as small as possible. The light passed over me once, then again its intensity cutting through the underbrush. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, so loud I was certain it could be heard. Every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for the light to stop, to fix on me, to expose me, but it didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the beam moved on, its glow fading as it swept further down the road. The forest was plunged back into darkness, the silence deafening. I stayed where I was, too afraid to move, straining my ears for any sound that might indicate the object's return. Minutes passed. Slowly, cautiously, I began to shift, my body stiff from the tension. Peering out from the bushes, I scanned the area, searching the sky for any sign of the light. It was gone, but the sense of dread lingered, heavy and unrelenting. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I needed to get home, and I needed to get there fast. I emerged from my hiding place slowly, my limbs stiff and sore from staying pressed against the ground. The forest was darker than ever, the flashlight lying somewhere along the road where I dropped it. I considered going back for it, but decided against it. Every instinct screamed to stay in the shadows, to move forward and not look back. Staying close to the tree line, I began walking. My pace was cautious at first, each step hesitant and measured. The darkness was suffocating, but the thought of being caught in that beam again propelled me forward. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing, though I knew logically they were just the sounds of the forest at night. After several minutes, the oppressive weight in my chest began to ease. The light was gone, and the sky above was clear and empty. A small part of me dared to hope that whatever it was had left for good. I quickened my pace, still keeping to the shadows, but feeling a sliver of relief creep in. And then it happened. The light reappeared, slicing through the darkness with terrifying precision. It fell on me immediately, as if it had been watching me all along, waiting for me to emerge from hiding. There was no time to think, no time to plan. My body reacted before my mind could process, and I took off running, adrenaline surging through my veins. The forest erupted around me as I sprinted through the trees, the beam of light following my every move. It was relentless, unyielding, illuminating my path and leaving no room to hide. The underbrush clawed at my legs, branches snapping against my arms as I pushed forward with everything I had. My lungs burned with each breath, and my legs screamed for relief, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even slow down. The sound of my own ragged breathing filled my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see if I did. The terrain was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip me at every step. Several times I stumbled, barely managing to catch myself before hitting the ground. The beam of light seemed to anticipate my movements, always a step ahead, always waiting to pounce. Then, through the dense trees, I saw it, my house. Its familiar silhouette stood against the horizon, a beacon of hope in the endless nightmare. I pushed myself harder, drawing on reserves of energy I didn't know I had. Each step brought me closer to safety, the beam still hot on my heels. The porch light flickered on as I approached, casting a dim glow over the front door. I leaped up the steps and grabbed the handle, wrenching the door open and throwing myself inside. I slammed it shut with a force that rattled the entire frame, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, all I could do was stand there, my back pressed against the door, gasping for air. The house was eerily silent, the familiar space suddenly feeling foreign and strange. I forced myself to move, stumbling to the nearest window and pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The light was gone. The forest was dark and still, as if nothing had ever happened. My heart was still racing, every nerve in my body on edge, but the absence of the light brought a fleeting sense of relief. I double-checked the locks on every door and window, then turned on every light in the house. The warmth of the bulbs felt hollow, but it was better than sitting in the dark. I sat in the living room, staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. The memory of that beam, the precision with which it followed me, was seared into my mind. Whatever it was, it had been watching me, hunting me, and it had almost succeeded. I had always been drawn to the hidden corners of the world, the places where maps faded into blank spaces. The remoteness, the quiet, the feeling of stepping into a life untouched by modern chaos. It was addicting. My latest journey had taken me through long stretches of rural countryside, hours of solitary driving broken only by the occasional glimpse of a farmhouse or the distant hum of a tractor. I reveled in the solitude, the sense that I was the only person for miles. The day was winding down when I came upon the village. It was almost hidden, tucked between rolling hills and dense woods, its red rooftops barely visible against the greenery. A narrow, winding road led me into the heart of it, where a small square opened up, surrounded by modest homes and shops. The place felt frozen in time, its quiet charm immediately drawing me in. The villagers were warm and welcoming. Within minutes of my arrival, I was greeted with smiles and invitations. A kind-faced woman handed me a fresh loaf of bread, while an older man insisted I take shelter for the night. After hours of driving, the idea of a hot meal and a roof over my head was too tempting to refuse. I thanked them profusely, grateful for their hospitality. But even as I settled in, there was something about their warmth that felt deliberate. Their smiles were just a little too wide, their gestures a little too practiced. I brushed the thought aside, telling myself I was overanalyzing. After all, rural communities often had their quirks. It was part of their charm, or so I thought. As night fell, the villagers gathered around me, their earlier joviality now replaced with an air of quiet formality. The man who had offered me shelter, Edwin, I think his name was, cleared his throat and began to speak. "We have a few guidelines for visitors," he said, his tone calm but firm. "They're for your safety as much as ours." The first rule was simple. I was not to leave my designated room after sunset. Curfews, I thought, weren't unusual in remote places. Perhaps they had concerns about wildlife or accidents in the dark. The second rule, however, was stranger. Several areas of the village were strictly off limits, even during the day. They were vague about what these areas were, but assured me I'd know if I approached one. Finally, they emphasized that I must inform them of any plans to leave, no matter how brief. Their insistence made me uncomfortable, but I nodded along, chalking it up to cultural peculiarities. Better to respect their ways, I told myself, even as unease prickled at the back of my mind. Later, as I lay in the small, candlelit room they'd prepared for me, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The single window faced the square, and though the curtains were drawn, I swore I saw shadows pass by now and then. I dismissed it as my imagination, pulled the blanket tighter around me, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, the village seemed almost idyllic again. The sun cast a golden glow over the square. Children laughed as they chased each other, and the villagers greeted me with the same warm smiles as the day before. I tried to push aside my lingering discomfort, determined to enjoy the charm of the place. But the sense of freedom was fleeting. As I wandered through the village, I felt their eyes on me, always watching. Edwin or one of the others seemed to appear at every corner, ready with a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. Any attempt to explore further out of the square was met with subtle resistance. A hand on my shoulder, a quiet, "That area's not safe," or a casual remark about how some paths were best avoided. By midday, the oppressive atmosphere became too much. I made a point of asking Edwin directly about the rules. Why were certain areas forbidden? What dangers could possibly exist here, in this peaceful, sunlit village? His reply was vague, laced with platitudes about keeping visitors safe and respecting local traditions. The answers only deepened my unease. It wasn't just the rules. The symbols carved into some of the buildings, the faint sound of chanting I swore I heard coming from the forest. It all painted a picture of something far darker than a quaint village with unusual customs. By nightfall, I knew I couldn't stay another day. Whatever kindness the villagers had shown was now overshadowed by the stifling control they seemed to exert over every aspect of my presence. I had no desire to find out what would happen if I broke their rules. Under the cover of darkness, I gathered my belongings, packing as quietly as I could. The house was silent, the only sound the creak of the floorboards as I tiptoed to the door. Outside, the square was bathed in pale moonlight, eerily quiet. My car was parked just a short distance away, and I moved quickly, staying close to the shadows. I was almost there when I heard it, a soft rustling behind me. I froze, turning slowly to see several villagers standing in the square, their faces half lit by the moon. They weren't angry, but their calmness was more terrifying than any outrage. One of them, Edwin, stepped forward. "You can't leave yet," he said, his voice steady but unyielding. "It's not safe." My heart raced as I stammered a protest, but before I could act, strong hands gripped my arms. The others moved swiftly, their calm expressions never faltering. I struggled, kicking and shouting, but it was no use. They dragged me away from the square, down a narrow path that led to the outskirts of the village. The hut they locked me in was small and cold, its walls made of rough wooden planks. The door was reinforced, its hinges groaning as it slammed shut behind me. In the suffocating darkness, panic surged through me. I was trapped, and whatever the villagers' intentions, I knew I couldn't stay to find out. The darkness inside the hut was absolute, broken only by faint slivers of moonlight seeping through the cracks between the wooden planks. The air was cold and damp, carrying the earthy smell of wet soil and rot. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any signs of movement outside, but all I could hear was the muffled sound of my own breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. The panic was unbearable, my thoughts racing in circles as I tried to make sense of the situation. Why had they locked me in here? What did they mean when they said it wasn't safe? Were they protecting me, or was I simply their prisoner? The questions clawed at me, each one more frantic than the last. I tested the door, first gently and then with more force. It barely budged, the planks reinforced with thick beams on the other side. My fists pounded against the wood, splinters biting into my skin as I shouted for help. But no one came. The silence outside was deafening, a void that swallowed my cries. Hours seemed to pass. The cold seeped into my bones and the cramped space of the hut began to feel suffocating. I wasn't going to wait for the villagers to come back. Whatever their intentions, I knew I had to get out. Now. I examined every inch of the hut, looking for a weakness. The walls were sturdy, the planks nailed together with precision, but the door, though reinforced, showed signs of wear. The hinges groaned when I pressed against them, and the wood near the bottom had started to splinter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I threw myself against the door with all the strength I could muster. The impact sent a jarring pain through my shoulder, but I didn't care. Again and again, I rammed it, each blow sending vibrations through the small structure. Splinters flew, the wood cracking a little more with every attempt. Sweat dripped down my face despite the cold, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. My body screamed in protest, the muscles in my arms and legs burning with effort, but I refused to stop. This door was the only thing standing between me and freedom. Finally, with one last desperate shove, the door gave way. It splintered apart with a loud crack, the reinforced beams snapping under the pressure. I stumbled forward into the night, the sudden rush of cold air hitting me like a slap. The village was eerily quiet, the shadows of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I didn't pause to catch my breath. I bolted. The path back to the village square was narrow and uneven, the moonlight barely enough to illuminate my way. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, every nerve on high alert. The silence around me was unnatural, oppressive, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard them. Footsteps. They were faint at first, distant and deliberate, but they grew louder with each passing second. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the figures emerging from the shadows, their movements calm yet purposeful. They didn't shout or call after me. They didn't need to. The sight of them was enough to send a fresh wave of panic coursing through my veins. I pushed myself harder, the uneven ground threatening to trip me at every step. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out, but I didn't dare slow down. The square came into view, and beyond it, my car. Its dull silhouette was the only beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. The figures were closer now, their footsteps rhythmic and steady. They didn't run, but their pace was relentless, as if they knew I couldn't escape. I reached the car, fumbling for the keys in my pocket with shaking hands. The footsteps were almost upon me as I threw open the door, slammed it shut, and locked it. The engine roared to life as I turned the key, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The figures stopped just short of the car, their faces illuminated in the harsh glare. They stared at me, their expressions calm, almost resigned, as if they had expected this all along. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the tires kicking up gravel as the car lurched forward. Unemployment had stretched into its third month, and desperation had a way of making even the strangest opportunities seem reasonable. That was how I ended up accepting a job offer that appeared out of nowhere. It came through an email with no listed company name, just a subject line that read, "Position available, generous pay." I should have been skeptical. Any rational person would have dismissed it as a scam, but the promise of steady work and a paycheck was too tempting. The instructions were straightforward. Show up at a remote location, bring only essentials, and trust that training would be provided on arrival. The offer was almost too good to be true, and maybe that should have been my first red flag. The drive to the facility took hours, winding through endless stretches of countryside until civilization seemed like a distant memory. When I finally arrived, the building loomed before me, a stark, windowless structure surrounded by dense forest. It looked less like a workplace and more like a bunker. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of trees in the wind. My new boss greeted me at the entrance. He was tall and sharp-featured, his suit pristine and his expression unreadable. "You're punctual," he said, offering a curt nod. His tone was polite but cold, as though warmth was a skill he'd never bothered to cultivate. He gestured for me to follow him inside. The interior of the facility was dimly lit, the walls a sterile gray. As he walked me through the building, he outlined my tasks in vague terms: organizing shipments, running simple maintenance checks, monitoring security feeds. It didn't sound complicated, but there was a strange emphasis on discretion. "You'll do exactly what's assigned to you, no questions asked," he said. "Do you understand?" I nodded, unsure of what I'd gotten myself into. The first week of work was uneventful, if a little strange. My tasks were mundane: inventory checks, organizing files, logging data into an outdated system. I saw no other employees, just my boss, who seemed to appear and disappear like a phantom. He rarely spoke unless it was to give an instruction, his eyes always cold and calculating. The facility itself was massive, a maze of identical hallways and locked doors. Most areas were off limits, marked with bold red signs that read "Authorized personnel only." I never asked what was behind those doors, though my curiosity grew with each passing day. The isolation was oppressive. My accommodations, a small, sparsely furnished room within the facility, offered little comfort. There were no windows, no way to gauge the time of day. Meals were left outside my door at precise intervals, delivered without explanation. The only noise came from the faint hum of machinery, a sound that seemed to seep into my bones. I began to notice the boss watching me. Not openly, but in the subtle way he lingered near doorways, or appeared at the edges of my peripheral vision. It was as though he was studying me, waiting for something. The feeling of being under constant surveillance was impossible to shake. By the second week, the nature of my assignments began to change. What started as routine and mundane became unsettling. My boss handed me a set of instructions one morning, his expression as cold as ever. "Follow this precisely," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The task seemed simple at first: deliver a locked case to a specific room. But the room, deep in the restricted part of the facility, was unlike any I'd seen before. The air felt colder there, the walls lined with strange equipment that hummed faintly. I didn't ask what was in the case. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Other tasks followed, each one more uncomfortable than the last. I was instructed to dispose of sealed containers in an incinerator, their contents undisclosed. Another time, I was told to clean a room that smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic, though nothing seemed visibly out of place. The unease grew into something sharper, a gnawing sense of wrongness. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just my imagination or that I didn't have the full picture. But the evidence was mounting, and my boss's increasingly cryptic behavior only deepened my suspicions. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a file left carelessly on a desk that everything clicked into place. The folder was marked with a single word: terminated. Inside were names, dates, and brief summaries of individuals who had worked at the facility before me. The notes were chillingly vague, with phrases like non-compliance and unfit for assignment scrawled in the margins. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages. There were no indications of where these people had gone or why their employment had ended so abruptly. My hands trembled as I turned the last page, finding a photograph that made my blood run cold. A man standing in the very room where I'd delivered the locked case. His face was blank, his eyes wide with terror. I shoved the file back into place, my heart pounding. The boss's voice rang out from somewhere down the hall, and I quickly composed myself, feigning innocence. I knew then that I was in over my head. Whatever was happening here, it was far more sinister than I could have imagined. Feigning ignorance became my only option. I followed orders without question, masking my growing fear behind a facade of compliance. But inside, I was planning, watching, waiting. The days that followed felt like a delicate game of survival. Every move I made was calculated, every word spoken measured. I forced myself to act normal, though my mind raced with questions and plans. The file I had found haunted me, its contents a constant reminder of the stakes. Whatever had happened to the people before me, I was determined not to share their fate. The opportunity came during an otherwise unremarkable moment. My boss had called me into his office to hand over another set of instructions, his demeanor as cold and unyielding as ever. As he spoke, I couldn't help but notice the set of keys lying on the edge of his desk. They were ordinary enough, simple metal keys on a loop, but I knew instinctively that they unlocked areas of the facility I wasn't supposed to access. He was distracted, flipping through a folder as he gave his instructions. My hands were clammy, my breath shallow as I calculated the risk. If he caught me reaching for them, it would be over. But if I let this chance slip away, I might never get another. The keys were the lifeline I needed. Summoning every ounce of nerve, I shifted my body slightly, leaning forward just enough to let my hand brush the desk. The keys were cool against my palm as I scooped them up, slipping them into my pocket in one fluid motion. My heart raced, but I forced my face to remain neutral, nodding along to his words as though nothing had happened. When he dismissed me, I walked out of the office with measured steps, the keys pressing into my leg like a burning secret. That night, under the cover of darkness, I made my move. The facility was eerily quiet, the corridors lit only by dim emergency lights. I crept through the hallways, each step slow and deliberate, my ears straining for any sign of movement. The first locked door I came to was marked with a red sign, "Authorized personnel only." My hands shook as I slid the key into the lock, the metallic click echoing too loudly in the silence. The door swung open to reveal a storage room filled with strange equipment, machines whose purpose I couldn't guess. I moved on, knowing this wasn't the way out. The next door led to a narrow staircase that descended deeper into the facility. My stomach churned as I debated whether to go down, but the faint sound of footsteps in the distance spurred me forward. The air grew colder as I descended, the walls damp and unwelcoming. At the bottom of the stairs, I found another door. This one was heavier, reinforced with bolts and marked with no sign at all. I tried one key, then another, my breath quickening with each failed attempt. Finally, the third key turned, and the door creaked open to reveal a passageway leading to the outside. The night air hit me like a wave, crisp and cold. I wanted to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet, moving quickly but cautiously toward the tree line that bordered the facility. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me flinch, but I didn't stop. My goal was clear, the car I'd parked far beyond the facility's entrance. As I approached the main road, the sound of an alarm shattered the silence. My heart sank as the faint wail grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of voices shouting in the distance. They knew I was gone. I broke into a sprint, adrenaline propelling me forward as the alarm blared behind me. The keys jingled in my pocket with every step, a cruel reminder of the risk I'd taken. I didn't look back, focusing instead on the path ahead, the faint outline of my car just visible through the trees. The voices grew louder, their urgency slicing through the night air. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook violently. It felt like an eternity before the engine roared to life. The headlights illuminated the forest in front of me, and I hit the gas, gravel spraying as the tires spun. Figures emerged from the trees, their faces illuminated briefly in the headlights. Their expressions were cold and determined, and I could see one of them, my boss, raising a hand as if to stop me. But I didn't hesitate. The car surged forward, leaving them behind as I sped down the empty road. Evening walks through the park had always been my refuge, a time to clear my head and escape the noise of the world. That night was no different, or at least it didn't seem to be at first. The air was crisp, carrying a faint mist that softened the glow of the streetlights lining the park's paths. The usual hum of distant traffic and rustling leaves felt muted, lending the park an eerie stillness. I followed the familiar trail, enjoying the solitude, until I noticed someone ahead. It was a lone figure, walking briskly. Even from a distance, their movements seemed off. They kept glancing over their shoulder, their pace uneven, as if they were being followed or were trying to escape something unseen. Intrigued, I slowed my pace, curiosity urging me to observe from a distance. As I rounded a corner, I expected to see them continuing down the path, but the figure was gone. The trail was empty, save for a strange mark on the ground where they had stood. Frowning, I approached, my heart skipping a beat as I crouched to examine it. The symbol was circular, carved with sharp, deliberate lines. It was intricate and geometric, almost hypnotic in its precision. I couldn't place it, but it carried an unsettling weight, as if it didn't belong here, or anywhere. I stood up quickly, brushing off my unease. It was probably just some strange street art or a prank, I told myself, though the rationalization felt hollow. The park was quieter than usual, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone. The symbol lingered in my mind as I continued along the path, its strange lines etched into my memory. The deeper I went into the park, the heavier the air seemed to grow, the usual sense of peace replaced by an unshakable tension. The mist had thickened, curling around the bases of the trees and obscuring the path ahead. I told myself to let it go, to focus on the familiar sights of the park. Yet every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of my footsteps on the gravel, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure again, but the trail remained empty. Then I spotted them. Two men stood further down the path, their postures rigid, their faces shadowed by the mist and dim light. They were dressed identically in dark jackets, their hands resting at their sides. As I approached, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The same symbol from the ground was embroidered on their jackets, faint but unmistakable. Their gazes locked onto mine as I passed, their eyes unblinking and cold. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to keep my expression neutral, my pace steady, but my heart was pounding. The moment I was past them, I quickened my steps, my unease growing with each stride. I resisted the urge to look back, afraid of what I might see. The path ahead felt endless, the park suddenly unfamiliar and unwelcoming. I could still feel their stares on me as I moved further down the trail, the weight of their gaze lingering like a physical presence. My steps quickened, my eyes darting to every shadow and shape around me. The once familiar park now felt like a labyrinth, the mist curling and shifting as though alive. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe the symbol was part of some local group, and their jackets were nothing more than a coincidence. But their expressions, cold, focused, predatory, were harder to dismiss. They hadn't just been looking at me, they'd been watching me. The exit to the park was just ahead, the dim lights of the street beyond a welcome sight. Relief began to seep in, my pace turning into a near jog, and then I heard it, a sudden burst of sound that froze me in place. Gunshots. The sharp, unmistakable cracks echoed through the mist, sending a jolt of fear through my body. I turned instinctively, searching for the source. Through the fog, I could just make out the faint outlines of the two men. They stood motionless for a moment before disappearing into the mist. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to move, nearly running now as I headed for the exit. Whatever had just happened, I wanted no part of it. The symbol, the men, the gunshots, it all felt connected, though I couldn't begin to understand how. All I knew was that I needed to get home. The moment I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me, sliding the chain into place and double-checking the deadbolt. My hands trembled as I turned off the lights, peering cautiously through the blinds. The street outside was empty, but the park loomed just beyond, its dark outline barely visible through the mist. I couldn't shake the image of the men from my mind, their eyes boring into me as though they knew something I didn't. The sound of the gunshots replayed in my ears, sharp and jarring. Were they aimed at me, or at someone, or something else? The questions swirled in my head, each one more unsettling than the last. I paced the small space of my apartment, replaying the evening's events. The figure, the symbol, the men, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. My logical side tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but the unease in my chest refused to dissipate. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed onto the couch, still fully dressed. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by fragmented dreams of the symbol and the cold, staring eyes of the men. When I woke, the morning light brought little comfort. The memory of the night before lingered, casting a long shadow over the day ahead. The morning felt surreal, as though the events of the night before had been a strange, fragmented dream. But when I stepped outside, the weight of reality hit me like a hammer. The symbol was there, etched faintly into the pavement just outside my apartment. My breath caught as I crouched down to inspect it. the lines unmistakable. I glanced around, half expecting to see the two men lurking nearby, but the street was quiet. Too quiet. The normal bustle of the neighborhood seemed muted, and a creeping paranoia settled over me. I hurried back inside, bolting the door behind me. Someone had been here. Someone had left that symbol. Throughout the day, the symbol haunted me. I saw it in places I hadn't noticed before, scratched into a park bench, drawn faintly on a dirty storefront window, even carved into the bark of a tree on my walk home. It wasn't just following me, it was everywhere. Desperate for answers, I turned to the internet, typing vague descriptions of the symbol into search engines. Nothing definitive came up, only obscure references to secret societies and urban legends. The more I searched, the more the sense of dread deepened. Whatever this was, it was far beyond anything I could comprehend. As the days passed, the feeling of being watched intensified. At first, it was subtle, a car parked a little too long outside my apartment, a figure lingering at the corner of my street. But soon, it became unmistakable. One evening, I found an envelope slipped under my door. There was no name, no address, just the symbol drawn in sharp black ink. My heart pounded as I unfolded the paper, expecting some kind of message. But it was blank, save for the symbol. Panic surged through me. They knew where I lived. They weren't just following me, they were sending a message. I tore the paper to shreds and flushed it down the toilet, but it didn't erase the fear. I began to notice shadows moving at the edges of my vision, shapes that disappeared the moment I turned to look. My apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a cage. I started sleeping with the lights on, every creak of the floorboards setting my nerves on edge. The breaking point came one night when I saw someone standing directly outside my window. I froze, the figure's face hidden in shadow. By the time I gathered the courage to approach, they were gone, leaving no trace behind. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay locked in my apartment any longer. I needed air, needed to convince myself that I was imagining things. I ventured out, keeping my head low and sticking to busy streets. But then I saw him. One of the men from the park, standing near the entrance of a grocery store. He wasn't shopping, wasn't talking to anyone. He was just standing there, staring directly at me. A wave of panic washed over me as our eyes met. I quickly turned and walked away, my pace quickening with each step. But when I glanced over my shoulder, he was following me. I ducked into an alley, weaving through back streets in a desperate attempt to lose him. My heart pounded in my chest, my breathing ragged as I darted through the maze of buildings. When I finally emerged onto a main street, he was gone. But the fear lingered, a gnawing certainty that he or someone else was still watching. I made it back to my apartment, locking the door behind me and pulling every curtain shut. My hands shook as I paced the room, the encounter replaying in my mind. I wasn't safe, not here, not anywhere. That night, I decided I had to leave. I packed a bag with the essentials, avoiding anything that might slow me down. The streets were dark and quiet as I slipped out of my apartment, my nerves on edge with every step. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and the city as possible. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the hum of the engine the only sound in the still night. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the overwhelming need to get away. It was late, far later than I usually stayed up. The kind of stillness that only comes in the dead of night had settled over my apartment, broken occasionally by the distant hum of passing cars or the faint groan of the heating system. I had been lost in a book, the hours slipping by unnoticed when the knock came. It wasn't loud, just a soft but deliberate series of raps against the door. My heart jumped, the unexpected sound cutting through the quiet like a knife. I froze for a moment, listening intently. It came again, more insistent this time. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. I set the book down and moved cautiously toward the door, my pulse quickening. Peering through the peephole, I saw a figure standing just beyond the porch light's glow. A man, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by the angle and shadows. He wasn't someone I recognized. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, hoping he would go away. But something about the way he stood there, still, patient, made me feel like he wouldn't leave so easily. I cleared my throat and called out, "Who's there? Sorry to bother you." the man replied, his voice calm and steady. I need some help. My car broke down a few blocks over, and my phone's dead. Could I use yours to call someone? His story was reasonable enough, but something in his tone gave me pause. It wasn't frantic or desperate like I'd expect from someone stranded in the middle of the night. It was measured. I hesitated, my hand still resting on the door. Where's your car? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Just down the street, he said quickly. I can't push it any further, and it's freezing out here. The request seemed harmless, but my unease lingered. I glanced through the peephole again, trying to get a better look. His clothes were ordinary enough, jeans, a jacket, boots, but they were clean, almost too clean for someone who had supposedly been working on a car. His face, though partially shadowed, seemed calm, his expression almost expectant. I'm sorry, I said, my voice firmer now. I can't let you in, but I can call someone for you. Do you need a tow truck? There was a brief silence, and I thought for a moment that he might walk away. Instead, he shifted slightly, leaning closer to the door. That's kind of you, he said, his tone polite. But I really just need a quick call. I won't be long. The request was simple enough, yet something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I kept replaying his words in my mind, trying to pinpoint what was bothering me. Was it his tone? The fact that he wasn't shivering, despite the cold? Or was it just the strangeness of the situation itself? I stood there, torn between politeness and the nagging sense that something wasn't right. You said your car is down the street? I asked, pressing for more details. Yeah, just a couple of blocks over, he replied quickly. It's parked by the corner, battery's dead, and I've been walking for a while. The story sounded plausible at first, but the way he rattled it off felt rehearsed. My gut told me to push further. Which corner? I asked, trying to sound casual. There was a pause, just long enough to set off alarm bells. I didn't catch the street name, he said, his tone a little tighter now. But it's not far. My unease grew. He just claimed to have been walking for a while, yet he couldn't remember where his car was parked. And if he'd been outside long enough to exhaust his phone, why didn't he look cold? His breath wasn't even visible in the frosty air. I'm sorry, but I don't feel comfortable opening the door, I said finally, my voice firmer this time. I can call someone for you if you'd like. There was a beat of silence, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted. It wasn't threatening, but it carried an edge I hadn't heard before. I'm not asking to come in. I just need a phone. It's really not a big deal. The subtle insistence sent a chill down my spine. I glanced through the peephole again, noticing for the first time how still he was. Too still. His arms hung at his sides, his posture unnaturally rigid. He didn't look like someone stranded and desperate for help. He looked like someone waiting. I can't help you, I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. Please leave. The words hung in the air, and for a moment he didn't respond. Then he took a step closer, his face now fully visible under the porch light. His expression was calm, too calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused. You don't have to be afraid, he said, his voice low. I just need a minute of your time. Fear gripped me. I backed away from the door, grabbing my phone off the counter. I dialed the police, my fingers trembling as I explained the situation in a hurried whisper. The operator assured me that an officer would be dispatched, but the 5-minute wait felt like an eternity. I could hear faint movement outside, the sound of his boots scraping against the porch as he shifted his weight. I stayed as quiet as I could, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. It's freezing out here, he called out again, his tone now laced with irritation. You're seriously just going to leave me like this? I didn't answer. The knock came again, harder this time. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard his footsteps retreating. I waited, my breath caught in my throat, until the faint sound of sirens broke the silence. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no lingering presence, no car down the street. The officer assured me it was probably a harmless encounter, someone in genuine need who'd simply moved on. But as I locked the door behind them and returned to the darkened living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been a few steps away from something far more dangerous. The house felt impossibly quiet after the police left. I had double-checked every lock and drawn every curtain, but the lingering unease refused to fade. I kept replaying the stranger's words in my mind, the tone of his voice, the subtle shifts in his demeanor. It hadn't been anger or frustration that unnerved me. It was the controlled calmness, the way he spoke as though he knew something I didn't. I couldn't resist the urge to peek outside. Pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the street, I scanned for any sign of movement. Nothing. The neighborhood was still, the empty road bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. No car, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. I tried to convince myself the police were right, that it was just someone in need who had left when help wasn't forthcoming. But deep down I didn't believe it. The way he had stood there, the subtle pressure in his voice, it wasn't desperation, it was something else, something deliberate. As the hours dragged on, I lay awake in bed, every creak of the house setting my nerves on edge. Sleep finally overtook me in the early hours of the morning, but it was restless and filled with strange, fragmented dreams of shadowed figures and soft, insistent knocking. The next morning, I stepped outside to retrieve the mail, hoping the light of day would help dispel the tension from the night before. Instead, it deepened it. Etched faintly into the frost on my front step was a mark. At first I thought it was random, a smudge left by boots or debris. But as I leaned closer, I saw it was deliberate, a small geometric symbol, almost like a signature. My heart skipped a beat. The police had found nothing, but this was proof someone had been there. I snapped a photo of the symbol with my phone, unsure of what else to do. My rational mind tried to explain it away, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Someone had been on my porch after the police left, maybe even while they were here. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A car I didn't recognize sat idling further down the street, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. A shadow moved behind a neighboring house, too quickly to catch clearly. My home, once a sanctuary, now felt exposed, vulnerable. I spent hours researching the symbol online, but I found nothing that matched. Every lead ended in vague references to secret groups or urban legends, none of which provided any real answers. The more I searched, the more the fear took root. That evening, just as I was starting to feel some semblance of calm, it happened again. A knock at the door. It wasn't as soft as the night before, but louder, more deliberate. My chest tightened as I froze in place, my hand instinctively gripping my phone. Slowly, I approached the door, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. The porch light illuminated the empty space where the stranger had stood the night before, but the sight of the vacant steps did nothing to soothe me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reached for the curtain, pulling it back just enough to see the street, still empty. I stepped away from the door, my stomach twisting with dread. And that's when I saw it, an envelope, slipped through the narrow gap under the door. My breath caught as I stared at it, the plain white paper, an unassuming presence that carried an unbearable weight. I didn't want to touch it, but curiosity and fear won out. I picked it up gingerly, my fingers trembling as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No words, no explanation. Just the same geometric symbol from my porch, drawn in sharp black ink. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The symbol felt like a threat, though I couldn't decipher its meaning. The stranger's face, his calm yet unnerving demeanor, played on a loop in my mind. Who was he? What did he want? And most importantly, was he coming back?